scary headlines about the pound and probably the hangovers from last night. So thank you very much for coming to this Demos event. My name's Polly Curtis. I am the new Chief Exec at Demos. Do come and have a chat with us afterwards if there's a way we can collaborate or work together. Today we're here to talk about how we can reform public services. So go
for the Labour Party at the moment, although my view is Labour needs a shared view about public service reform that we can use across the piece to explain to the public what it is we intend to do if we're in power, in a way that lets them understand what we're trying to do and achieve with society and our communities more generally. We also have to tackle a political threat, I guess, which is that Conservatives will attack Labour for investing money in public services without reforming them. And I think we need an answer to that, to be able to counter that when the as we draw nearer to the election. My experience as a council leader in Lambeth, which is a while back now, because I've been an MP for 10 years, was that top-down public services, and that's the way that they were run, decisions taken at the top about people on the front line, were welcome and were beneficial, but not as effective as they could have been if the insights and creativity of the community that was using those public services had been taken into account when they were being shaped and when they were being delivered. I think if you deliver, and I'm talking not so much about the universal public services like collecting the bins, but the more expensive public services that take a larger part of the budget, which is dealing with people or families with very, very complex and challenging needs. If you do to those people things that you think they want, but they don't see it the same way, they resist what you're trying to do, and that creates an inefficiency in the system because they're not working and collaborating with you, because they feel that they don't have agency or control over decisions that are going to have a very profound effect on their lives and their circumstances. As a result of that, they experience a loss of agency. So their experience of life is decisions taken about them by others, which they have very little say, and they would like to have say over their own lives, just like all the rest of us would like to. And that can create a sense of forced dependency, where you do not have control, you do not have choice. And my experience of seeing public services run differently is that they're far more effective because the people who are receiving them are able to shape them so they do more of what they really want, and they're more amenable to taking the interventions because they feel that they've helped to shape and design them. So there are a lot of reasons why top-down public services of themselves do not do enough. If you give people more control over decisions that affect them, they will instinctively push public services to prevent problems rather than try and manage them. And Keir Starmer has talked a lot about the need for more preventive public services, and this is what he means. You have to shift them to stopping a problem rather than just managing the problem once it's happened. The problem with that in terms of funding is you have to invest up front in order to get the savings further down the line, but overall it costs the public services less if you stop problems happening before they begin, rather than try to manage them once they have already started. And the third point I wanted to make about the need for reform is what is called relational public services. So very often, public services will identify an individual with a problem and target a service on them without taking into account the networks that support and sustain that individual in their own lives, whether that's their family, their friendship, or community networks, all of which is a resource that they will instinctively trust and that cares about this individual and would like to help them, but that we leave out of the equation when we're delivering public services. And a more relational approach takes all of that into account and tries to engage the networks around the individual and trying to deal with the problem. Now, at core, my view is the shift we're trying to make is from top-down public services to co-production. Co-production is not a fixed and rigid model. It is an approach that seeks to share power between those who are delivering a public service and those who are using a public service. Very often, in order to equalise that power dynamic, you have to change the decision-making structures of the public services, because the way that they're set up currently the providers will have a lot of power, the users will have very little, and you can't equalise decision making while there's a power imbalance like that. So you need different models of decision making in order to allow co-production to happen. But when you do it, you get a very, very different outcomes from your public services. My experience is you get better outcomes whatever the level of funding you've got available. And it seems very likely with the Conservatives currently setting fire to the economy, that the incoming Labour government is not going to have the level of funding that we would hope to have, at least not at the start, to invest in public services. So we'll need to make them work better, more effectively, deliver better outcomes without the level of funding that ideally you'd want to be able to invest in. I just want to give a couple of examples, if that's okay. So when I was the leader of the council in Lambeth, we were elected, it was a long time ago, in 2006. But when we were elected, took over from a Lib Dem Tory coalition, the council's children's services were rated in the bottom 3% nationally and had a history, a legacy of absolute failure with industrial scale child abuse having gone on, which has now become much more apparent. By opening up power and decision making to the kids in care and their carers, foster parents, we were able in 5 years to transform those services. So they went from being rated after the bottom 3% nationally to the best in the country, and still the only council's children's services that were rated outstanding in every single category. And that was not insights from the councillors or the professionals, that was simply allowing the people that were relying on those services a voice and putting in place mechanisms that allowed them to assert a voice. And it was transformative because they understood the challenges in their own lives far better than anybody that wasn't living with them. It makes absolute common sense when you say it like that, but we do not use and harness those insights and that resource which is in our communities to shape our public services. I've got other examples which I'll only go into if people ask me questions, but I'm Shadow Justice Secretary now, and we're looking at taking an approach like this into the criminal justice system, particularly built on trauma-informed practice and what we've learned about adverse childhood experiences and the damage that a lack of love or even a child witnessing or experiencing physical or sexual abuse, the way that damages a child's emotional and cognitive development makes them much more likely to get involved in offending as they grow older, and that can go all the way through life. If you take trauma-informed approaches to tackling that, and particularly if you work with the communities of which they are part, from whom they will accept support much more readily than from established authority, you can transform their life experience and dramatically reduce the chances of offending or reoffending. So we're looking at the criminal justice system and how we can take approaches like this to totally transform it, opening up power somewhat to the communities and individuals that are involved, and dramatically, I hope, pushing towards a more preventive to our public services. And my experience of doing public services like this is whatever level of funding is available, we get far better outcomes for the people who are using those services, but it's also beyond that transformative in their own experience of their own life, because instead of feeling that they are subject to decisions about them taken by others, they start to feel that they have control back over their own life, and that really allows them to uncap aspiration and build themselves much better lives than they ever could have imagined were open to them.
I actually have a question already. So just coming back on your on the children's public services, children's services example, did you save money?
Yeah, well, our funding was being reduced at the time the services improved. So we were putting less in because the government was cutting the funding, but the quality of the services went up. So that's clearly an efficiency gain.
Did it keep kids out of care?
It kept kids out of, we reduced youth violence quite dramatically over that period. It was, I mean, I think there was something that, it was the, was it Victoria Klingbeil or Baby P scandal that happened around then, and that made the whole system much more risk averse. So a lot more kids across the country were being put on the at-risk register at that point. So there were factors outside our council's control. But certainly for those young people that were in care, the outcomes for them dramatically improved, and the level of offending started to fall very, very dramatically in a very short period of time as well.
Thank you so much.
So when I was thinking about this, and I was particularly struck by the part of the title, which was about Backlog Britain, and really the comments that I wanted to make kind of address that today, more than anything else. And so I think it's a really important panel to talk about this. I think that whenever the election comes, this is going to be a really central issue. And you know, if we were against the odds and against historic precedents to win the next election, then it would be one of the big challenges that we have. And I think it's really crucial, therefore, for Labour politicians not just to expose the ways in which the government is failing the country, but also to explain what the Labour Party would do instead when facing those challenges. And that's why this panel, I think, is doubly important today. In my role as Shadow Attorney General, my main day-to-day encounters with the effects of Backlog Britain are the delays that we're currently seeing at every stage, frankly, of the criminal justice system. So most notably, at the last count in March, we had just above 344,000 cases, waiting to be heard in magistrates' courts, and just below 59,000 cases waiting to be heard in the Crown Courts. 59,000 cases waiting to be heard in the Crown Courts. So earlier this year, we discovered that for the first time, the typical rape case is now taking more than 1,000 days to come to court. So that's from original offence to the completion of the case. You just think about what that must mean for the survivor of a rape. You experience the most unimaginable ordeal. You go through the trauma of reporting what has happened. You're one of a tiny minority, frankly, of people whose cases actually come to court. 1.3% of rapes come to court. And then your attacker is actually charged, and thanks to the current court backlogs, you have to wait almost 3 years to even see the chance of justice being done and the sentence handed down. I know that Steve was on the Today programme talking about a particularly terrible case of a young girl, a child, who had been raped, and how she had had her life blighted and the lives of her family blighted by the years that she'd had to wait and the number of times her case had been adjourned. And this is before the pandemic. This is before any strike. This is a fundamental problem with the criminal justice system. And it's the greatest tragedy of backlogs in our courts is justice delayed is justice denied, and that's the truth. Even the most rock solid cases can simply collapse. They can simply disappear because victims or witnesses just cannot deal with the destruction and the trauma that they're having to go through just whilst they wait for their day in court. Imagine living on an estate here in Liverpool and having the bravery to come forward to be a witness in one of these gang cases, and then to have the fear of waiting between the time of reporting the case or being a witness in that case to coming to court, and what that must mean to you and your family if it continues over years. You tell the police you're prepared to testify in court, but after years, would you still be quite as keen? And we know that in reality is one of the reasons why cases keep collapsing as well. And frankly, should anybody even be surprised? So what's the government doing about this? Well, just like the NHS, just like the Passport Office, just like the driving test centres, just like Asylum and Immigration Department, and it's just everywhere. Everywhere we see backlogs in the UK. And what kind of we've had the same response from the government when it comes to backlogs in the courts. They have the same attitude to all of it. First of all, they deny that there's a problem at all. Right? And when we say, well, that's not right, there is definitely a problem, then they say it's all the fault of the pandemic. And when we prove that that's patently false, we show that there were backlogs before the pandemic, then they say, well, it's got to be someone else's fault or something else's fault is to blame for why the backlogs can't be reduced and won't be reduced, and basically anything at all, in order to be able to avoid taking responsibility and actually dealing with the issue. And that's the reality, everyone knows it and everyone sees it. And frankly, none of this is going to change under Liz Truss. Let's be under no illusions about that. I actually fear, given the direction that this new government is going in, it's going to get worse. It can only get worse. If you deny funding, which is essentially what they're going to be doing, they are cutting taxes, and to the extent that they are, interest rates are going to go up to the extent that it is, our debt is going to continue to go up. In what circumstances are they going to be putting more money or more focus on public services? I mean, they're simply not. And the situation is going to get worse, in my view. And also, what do they believe in? They believe in a small state. That's what they believe in. Truss, Kwarteng, Rees-Mogg, Redwood, all these figures are in the ascendancy at the moment in the Conservative government. And they don't think that backlogs are a problem to be fixed. That's not a priority for them. It's not their priority to get public services back on track. These are crises, in fact, in my view, that they think are crises that they can use to exploit. Because if the system's not working, then they can start saying, what's the point? These services aren't really worth the paper they're written. We need to have a broader debate, in my view, about the state, about the role of the state. What is the state about? I mean, the state, for me, is the expression of our collective will. What is it we want to do? What kind of society do we want? To what extent are we prepared to look after each other? To what extent do we have values? Where are they? What are they? And how do they work? And that, for me, actually, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, is we should embrace it and not be afraid of it. So that's why I say at the outset that we simply can't gather at events like this or debates in Parliament and criticise the government for its failure to get to grips with these backlogs. Because the reality is, the government's not going to listen, and the government's not going to care. Instead, I think what we need to do as a party is we need to develop the solutions ourselves and set them out in public. As Claire has said this time last year, what we need is a party of practical action. And I think the work that Steve is doing, we're doing in the Justice team, is a really important part of that. And in relation to the courts, Steve can set out some of the practical changes that we would introduce to get the wheels of justice turning again. And last month, I announced our contribution in the law officers team to that effort, which is that we have a proposal to introduce 127 legal executives who are currently employed by the Crown Prosecution Service, every one of them an experienced criminal law practitioner. And we want them to have greater responsibilities than they do at the moment for managing criminal cases, not just in the magistrates' court, but to be able to do more than they do, and it's currently they're forbidden to, and there's really no reason why they should. If you have a qualification in criminal law, and you have, many of these people have now 10 years experience, it's just dogma. It's stopping them from being given a greater role, and there we are, boom, 127 additional. But you just need to be able to think in practical ways. You need to be able to think laterally in order to be able to come out with these solutions. And these are the kinds of practical steps that we need. Getting all available hands on deck to start getting backlogs down and putting the current delays in our courts and elsewhere into sharp decline. So I've got one final point, I think, that I want to make, which I think is particularly appropriate to this gathering today, because it does require the kind of serious thought and analysis that organisations like Dermot's are famous for. And it's simply this: when we do manage to get backlogs down in courts, in our health service and elsewhere, I do think that we need to have a clear plan and structure for how we're going to keep those backlogs down, keep them down from ever building up again. And I think that one of the things we need to think about is the role of intelligent target setting, because I do think that plays a role. I think that by the time we left government in 2010, targets have been given a bad name, and within public services. And indeed, I remember Osborne using it time and time again as a way of saying that we were just micromanaging, it wasn't really delivering results, and so he scrapped top-down targets and he was applauded in the media for doing so. And applauded for getting rid of red tape and allowing public servants to get on with their job. And now we see it. You go into A&E, you see it. You see it. And so I think we paid a big price for the loss of those targets. And when we do get through the backlog and restore our public services to the kind of steady state that it needs to be in, we need to look again at how we use targets in a more efficient and effective way to hold Secretaries of State accountable for their jobs, and for the timelessness and quality of the work that they do and the services that they're responsible for delivering. I think that it needs to help, and that will help Secretaries of State to identify where the bottlenecks are appearing in the system. I think that it's measurable, and I think that it helps with intervention and with action. So all of that perhaps needs to be discussed in detail on another day, but I do want to raise it here this morning as kind of part of one of the many things that we need to be thinking about urgently, because we go to the public and we ask for their permission to serve, and we go to the public and we say there's another way, it doesn't have to be like this, and we need to make sure that we have a clear alternative that has been properly thought through.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. Just one question to follow up on that. A week ago when I was planning this event, this was going to be a very policy-heavy conversation. In the past week, the investment in public services has become ever more political. How do you avoid Labour presenting as big state, big spending, and to change that story around public services?
Well, I think that's the point. That's what I'm saying, actually, is that we've now got a government that's so ideologically driven that actually they're trying to actively undermine, I think, the institution. I mean, Liz Truss talks about the state as being malevolent, that it should get out of the way. You know, that's the far right ideology that's been imported from the United States into the centre of Britain, and into the centre of our politics. That's where we are. That's what we need to respond to. And I think that we shouldn't be afraid of saying, as I've said today, that actually, what is the state about? The state is about us coming together. The state is about us coming together and working out what kind of country we want, and our country is held up by the institutions of the state, and that's not something to be afraid of. I mean, I'm a lefty. It's kind of amazing that I get provoked into speaking like this, but it's true. It speaks an essential truth of who we are.
Thank you so much. Rhodri.
Thanks, Mark. I'm assuming that most people here today don't know what Reading Partnership actually does. And for me as Managing Director, that's a good thing, because it means we haven't been in the press causing any issues for our government commissioners. But we are part of the Read Group. Most people will know us from the high street recruitment work that's undertaken in the TV adverts. But Reading Partnership itself specialises in delivering public services. Last year, just over 2 million people went through our delivery programmes, and we've got offices all the way from Truro down in Cornwall up to the Shetlands, with most of the major sort of cities and towns in the covered. So what is it that we actually do? Well, the reason I've worked for Reading Partnership for such a long time is because all of our programmes have a consistent theme. And that theme is about helping people achieve the goals that they want to achieve for themselves. And that goes across our NHS programmes, where we help people lose weight, quit smoking, or prevent the onset of diabetes, where we help long-term unemployed and people with health and disabilities move into employment, or on some of our programmes targeting very specific disadvantaged groups, such as asylum seekers who are likely to remain in the UK, re-establish themselves. And all of those contracts and the experience we have in many of the most disadvantaged communities sort of gives us a pretty unique perspective on how you can put people at the heart of public services. And I'm just going to talk about two of the quick challenges that I think would face any incoming Labour government, both of which touch on Stephen and Emily's points as well. And I think, having seen change of governments and also a sort of a pretty rapid change in administrations over the last few years, there is always a temptation for new ministerial teams to come in and think that you have to do some big organisational changes to really shake things up. We've seen that expensive consultants often arrive and point to organisational change, but our experience of delivering services and working with both central and local government, those changes often don't achieve the results that you want in the short or medium term. And that's because they impact on staff morale, take capacity and resources, already very stretched budgets. And from a politician's perspective, they also don't often achieve change as quickly as the voters want to see. A long time ago, I worked in the Labour Party policy unit back when we were in government, and I understand the need for catchy press releases and new initiatives. But actually, as Emily's mentioned, there is a real focus on any incoming government about how you target set public services, about how you provide accountability for those services, and how you provide some assurance for the public about what you're trying to achieve from public service reform. And it's sort of a really important aspect that we get in terms of how we deliver services. So at 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock each day, we survey pretty much most of the people who have gone through our provision, and we get live data coming in telling us about what people have said about our services that day. And we use it to refine our service delivery, so we're always trying to be responsive to what people need. And thinking about kind of wider public service reform, the feedback that we get, and I think it's really important in terms of designing services, is about the accessibility of provision. Can people access services at a time and a place that suits them? It's also about the personalisation of public services. And we used to talk in the Labour Party a lot about personalisation, and actually to achieve that, you've got to go back and start trusting and empowering your frontline workers to achieve that change. And then finally, people want access to services quickly, and if they can't access services quickly, you need to tell them how long they're going to wait. And I think that's a really important part of the current debate in terms of people not having certainty about when they'll have access to service provision. And the second sort of key challenge I think any incoming Labour government will face is that many of the big public policy issues don't fit neatly into individual government departments. And I think one of the aspects of government is that you need to be able to work collaboratively across government departments. For instance, if you don't want to tackle the skills shortages in terms of health and social care workers, it's going to require not just the health and social care department, but the Department for Education, plus the Home Office, plus the Treasury, to really work together to tackle some of those issues. And I think that if we're going to move away from that silo mentality, which has become, I think, a problem of late, particularly with the government, very much focused on Brexit and then COVID, it means the policy making has to be quite different. And I think for the Labour Party, sort of making sure that policy is developed across shadow ministerial teams rather than just within them is really critical. And I would just say in sort of conclusion that while some of these things are quite difficult to achieve, the Labour Party knows that it is possible to achieve them, because it's managed to do some of that cross-government work on calls like child poverty, reducing NHS waiting times, and improving school standards. But I think the big challenge the Labour Party is going to face, if it does move into government in the next 18 months, is that it's going to have to do that again, but with much less money in the public sector to achieve this change. And that's why the kind of core design that Steve talked about is really critical. But also you have to have and move back towards the target setting that we see in the previous Labour.
Thank you so much for that, Rhodri. And actually, I'm going to pick up that last point and put it back to all three of you on the silos in the state. So we have done some research recently on policing, and actually, when you scratch the surface, actually a lot of what policing is about mental health now. Same with the NHS, kind of dealing with the social care crisis, children's social care, dealing with housing and poverty problems. The blending of the problems when the state becomes so weak, it comes out in surprising ways that breaks down those silos. Maybe I can just put that point to Steve. How do you actually build services that are around people's real lives?
It's a real challenge in public services. It's one that we were trying to deal with when I was a council leader, and I know councils are doing it still. I don't know if the guy from Camden New Journal is still here, but Camden, is he?
No, there he is.
Oh no, there he is. Good, because Camden have actually got a really good model of this. But the problem with, I'm going to talk again about families with complex and challenging needs, because that is where the vast majority of spending goes, and that is where the challenges that we all face as a society are the greatest if we want to create a fairer and more equal society. What happens to families like that, complex needs and multifaceted, is you've got all of these different services that all do things to them separately from their own point of view, whether it's mental health services, family support, drug and alcohol cessation. They're all siloed and doing things to that family. From the point of view of the service provider, it makes complete sense, because they understand their service, they see a problem to be fixed, and they target their support on it. But for the family receiving that support, they're just subject to a plethora, a complex of different interventions which don't join up, don't make sense to them, and sometimes feel like they're conflicting with each other. So it just creates frustration on the part of that family and anger sometimes, and they then resist what the services are trying to do to them. So it doesn't create the outcomes that's intended to happen. The different way of dealing with those services is you put that family at the centre and you let them control the services rather than allow the services to control the family. And there was the practice was developed in New Zealand. It's called family group conferencing, but Camden is one of the councils that leads in the UK on doing that. And the way that it would work is you take a family with challenging needs, you get your professionals not to tell them what they're going to get, but to sit down with them. The family can bring in anybody they like from their community whose authority they respect. It might be faith leaders, it might be friends, it might be other community leaders, and they hold the ring. The professionals sit around, the family talk about the challenges they've got in their life, the professionals are allowed to come in at the behest of the family, and they together assemble a set of interventions that make sense to the family and join up. So the family are much more likely to then accept the interventions. Family group conferencing, because the family is in control rather than being subject of a range of disjointed interventions. And the outcomes are far better for that family, they're far quicker, the family engages with it more positively, and it costs less because you're taking inefficiency out of the system. So that, I think, is a model that we should be learning from, the best of our Labour councils as well as internationally. But there's a model there that we could be using right across public services. And I hope that's where the party will end up.
I'm just actually going to bring in my colleague Andrew Demos just to briefly talk about universal work services, which is a project we've been working on. And I think it takes quite a similar approach to a person-centred view. So, Andrew, do you want to just say a couple of words on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, this is a piece of work we did as part of our public services reform work we've been doing over the last year or so, and we looked at employment support services and thought about, looked at them through the kind of relational lens. And what we found was we did focus groups and interviews with people receiving employment support from job centres. And what we found was that they said they felt it was they described the meetings they had there in very kind of transactional terms. So people said that it was often kind of a tick box kind of exercise they felt, and they felt that support from the job centre was not well joined up with other kinds of support that was available. There was one person who said that she received some really great support from a charity that works with kind of young people in London on kind of employment skills, but she just found that via Google. So she hadn't been referred to it or anything, it was just the fact she had randomly happened to find it. And she said, why wasn't I not told about that this existed? And so the work we did was we proposed kind of reforming employment support services so that they work together in a more holistic way, kind of joining up different parts of support that currently exist in the siloed way we've just been talking about. And so we called that a universal work service, which would be kind of universally accessible that everyone can use, but would then act as a gateway to direct people to the right kind of support for them, depending on their employment or skills needs.
Thank you for that, Andrew. I think it just talked to that point about how we organise around.
Yeah, I mean, the principle is where does power lie? Instead of power being in the hands of the service provider, it has to be in the hands of the service user, and then the whole thing reconfigures. So I think if there was one principle behind it, it's that.
Yeah.
I think that it also isn't about leadership. So it's about somebody being responsible for making those decisions and making sure they're making those decisions across the piece. So in particular circumstances, it may be family, but it also may be at national level, making sure that you have leadership from a Prime Minister who can see across the piece and say, well, this department's doing very well on this, but around the edges, there's a great hole, and here's another one, but like this crevice is still there and it's getting bigger and deeper. We need to be able to move across it, so you need to be able to have, different departments working together. I mean, the work that we're doing at the moment, starting to do at the moment on fraud, for example, there are so many different departments that deal with fraud. We get Kwasi Kwarteng saying that fraud isn't a common day experience for people. It absolutely is. I mean, we may think in terms of crime being you know, when you go to a pub, be careful about putting your handbag down because someone might nick your handbag. And that's kind of 20th century crime. But actually what also might be happening in your handbag is you open it up and there's some message from some so-and-so who sort of sends you a message about, you know, give us your credit card details, and without thinking, and maybe on the wrong side of a pub, you know, too much drink, you just go, oh right, yeah, I better do that. There you are, bam, you're a victim of crime. And we don't have 21st century response to that. But we don't have 21st response, not just in terms of the police, but also, you know, government departments are being defrauded, you know, public sector is being defrauded, you know, and we don't know how much of it comes from abroad, how much of it comes, you know, is home. We don't know how much money is lost. You know, so that you might have like the Treasury dealing with fraud in terms of people not paying their taxes. We might have, you know, and it comes in so many different ways. But the bottom and top of it is actually the most frequently experienced crime. And it undermines our public services, it undermines people's trust in being able to buy things online. You know, it has a huge impact. And is anyone doing any thinking about that? Certainly not in government, they're not. You know, but what we need to do, again, it's like, I mean, as I say, Steve's example of leadership in a way comes from the family. But on subjects like this, the leadership needs to come from somewhere. Just somebody, just be responsible for getting these people together, thinking about what's the 21st century response? What kind of investigators do we need? What kind of skill sets do they need? Do they need the same skill sets as maybe the guy, you know, who comes along in a policeman's uniform and deals with your handbag being stolen? Is that the same as the one who should be looking at what's happening within your handbag on the credit card? No. But we haven't thought through how that works.
Well, you ask who's doing the thinking on that.
Ah.
A very good report on policing, which speaks exactly to that point, the out-of-date mode of policing that's missing these huge areas of crime that are actually incredibly painful for people to deal with. So you talk about fraud.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's incredibly stressful situations.
It's embarrassing on one level. Yeah. You just feel, oh my, I know, really? Did I really? I mean, when it happened to me, I put it on Twitter because I thought, I'm just going to be out about this. Because if I can be, you know, conned by such a stupid fraud, and you look at it again, you can, but actually many people were getting it. But then also, you know, your mum might have somebody turning up on her doorstep, as happened to my mother-in-law, wearing a helmet and so on. Nobody ever knew, persuading her that she needed to go off to a cash point, get money out and give it to him. Awful, terrible, terrible. You know, but preying on the vulnerable, you know, that is just shocking. But it's a very common crime. And the difficulty is that because it's so difficult to catch, actually what you find, from my own experience when I was a criminal lawyer, people who get into that groove of committing those sorts of crimes, it's quite difficult to get them out of it because it's such an easy crime.
Yeah.
So they even if they're getting convicted, they only get conviction on a minority of those cases, and they come back out because it's so lucrative and do it again.
So the point you're making at the beginning there about leadership, leadership needs to spot the gaps that things are falling through into and the overlaps in the silos that need addressing. Roger, your point around trusting the professionals is quite key in that, isn't it? So how we trust public sector professionals to kind of lead this process.
Yeah, it's really fundamental if you're going to deliver services that meet people's needs, and we see it in sort of how we recruit and train staff. You have to we work with a lot of very vulnerable people. You have to be really creative in terms of how you address those problems. So we just completed a sort of big project around machine learning. We worked out that we were actually doing about 5,000 separate interventions just on customer group. Because you might have somebody whose main barrier going back to employment crime is grief. You need to bring in some grief counselling to help people get through some of those issues. And then another person may need something completely different in terms of skills interventions, etc. So, one of the areas that I think has suffered is the kind of lack of workforce development, both in terms of recruitment, but also about how you make some of these public service occupations really valuable and seen as important and development of people that go into them so you make it more of a career, because that's really important if young people going into the labor market.
Thank you. Picking up on the conversation we started around prevention, how do we make the case for prevention?
It saves money. is one very obvious one.
Yeah.
But I mean, it saves
But
money.
it hasn't worked so far, because, everybody agrees prevention is a good thing, but it's really hard to make the case that it does save money.
But the problem is it's not measurable. That's the problem. So where we have a world where you're like, pay this money, get this back, it's very difficult to measure. If you're really effective at preventing something, then people almost don't even know that it potentially might have happened. I
But you can compare what you had before with what
Yeah.
you get in the future, so you can kind of quantify it in that way. But it saves money as one, because if you've got less of a problem, you don't have to manage the problem because it hasn't happened. But also in society, not having those problems existing makes for a more cohesive and resilient society. So in human terms, it's better, as well as in financial terms. And the reason it's not happening is because the Conservative government, when they got in 2010, started to make cuts in public services so rapidly that they did not allow time to transform how services were being delivered. So organisations effectively retrenched. They went back to core business, which was managing the central part of their service, and the bits they stripped out were the partnership work and the preventative elements, because they were being measured on the core business, not what might happen in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. So basically, stripped funding out of prevention. And that's why you see less of it now. It's simply the way and the speed with which the Conservative government pulled funding away from those services, leading to retrenchment. But where we look at services that have managed to do it, whether it's in this country or another, and I'll use the example of New Zealand because it connects with what Emily and I are looking at in terms of trauma-informed practice and crime prevention. They have a really established now approach to children and young people's well-being. It's built around trauma-informed practice. It's run from the Prime Minister's office, so directly connecting with what Emily just said about leadership from the top. And in a strange way, you do need leadership from the top in order to enable leadership from the bottom. Because if the top won't allow it to happen, then there's a massive roadblock in the way. And what they've done is they've invested much more in understanding adverse childhood experiences, the trauma that can occur for a young person, as I said earlier on, witnessing or even subject to physical or sexual abuse, or starved with love, or living with a parent with alcohol or drug addictions, and having to witness the problems in their lives without support. If you put that support in, then that child's life chances dramatically improve in terms of educational attainment, earnings potential, employability, and almost every aspect of their life. They become more successful. And New Zealand has been doing it enough now to be able to start to point to some of those benefits that you get. And yet this Conservative government continues to strip away funding from services of that kind. And given what they've just announced with trashing the public finances, that is inevitably going to lead to much more cuts to public services that are already on their knees, and we're going to go backwards even from this miserably low point that we're at with this government. It's one of the reasons why it is imperative that we get to Labour government at the next election to start to correct the problems that this is causing for our society as a whole, because it's fracturing it and fragmenting it, because we allow these problems to grow, and then we all have to try and live with the consequences of it.
I'm mindful of making this conversation between me and Steve somewhere else, but can I also just add something else in, which is something that the New Zealand government or New Zealanders have been doing for a very long time, which has been kind of tried, and then people just didn't follow through on it. And it remains a good idea, it continues a good idea, it should be doing, but it's also an important part of the way they approach things. It's also, it works particularly well with kids, is if they do end up committing a crime, they have to talk to their victims, and they have to learn what the experience is, because so much of it is alienation, so much of it is just like not thinking through the effects of your actions, as happens with so many teenagers in many different ways, from kind of just mildly irritating to the very, very serious crimes. And so just kind of getting them to kind of connect, this is what I did, and this is the effect, and this is the person. If it isn't directly that victim, it's a victim who suffered something very similar. And that is kind of, and that also, and the victims like it as well. And it ties them, it ties the youngster down. It makes them understand, their connection, their responsibility. And that is something that New Zealand has done for a very long time. It's a very important part of it. So you're then attacking it from both ends, but you're also bringing the community in at both ends.
So there's an interesting point about public services not just being about improving the relationship between state and people, but improving social cohesion between people. I'm going to come to the floor after the next question, so do be ready. So just on implementation, if we were to move to a more relational, preventive way of working, how do we do that now when so many public services are, as you say, Steve, on their knees? How can you reset a system that's so struggling with the kind of day-to-day?
Well, in my experience, is you can't do it as a big bang. You can't just elect a Labour government and the next day public services operate in a very different way. You've got to kind of do it incrementally and pragmatically. And where you would go is, first of all, those services that are already doing some of this, so that understand it, so you can support them, to develop them, to demonstrate to everyone else what it is that you're trying to achieve. And then secondly, those services that are failing the most, because where there's significant service failure, everyone understands that you can do things differently, and you've got different models. So you kind of create islands of best practice, and then allow them to develop, and then the system will slowly move towards change. So I believe here in incrementalism, actually, rather than revolution, because you don't want to knock over public services that are already struggling to survive. There's an issue of funding here. And again, I'm just speaking my own personal view as well in the position of the Labour Party, but I know there has been a public discussion around this. But it's always struck me as very odd that if you're building something like HS2, you'll invest vast amount of money in it up front and then allow it to be paid back over the following 30 years. But we don't take that approach to an individual with hugely challenging needs as a child. We allowed ourselves to invest up front in, if you can identify a child, with a kid whose parents have got severe mental ill health, drug and alcohol addictions, and domestic abuse. All of those things happen in a large number of families, sadly. You know that kid's life chances are very, very stunted. If you are able to invest up front in that family and that child, you can dramatically improve that child's chances of success in life, so that you can make it more likely they become an employable, successful, happy citizen who contributes through the tax system as well as socially to society, rather than becoming a cost on society because their life is failing. So if you have a model for people, a bit more like the model that we have for railways, you could invest the money in and then pay it back in the savings that you would get over a longer period of time. I think that is something we should be exploring. That is my own personal view.
I mean, my experience, I had a particularly salutary experience when I was Shadow Health Secretary, and the Tories, when they first got introduced under Lansley the Health and Social Care Act, and I'm a veteran of that, of the fight to stop that, and we had many months in committee, and then they changed it, and we had to have more months in committee again. But it was like them wrestling with, their ideology, which was completely at odds with what the National Health Service is about, but also trying to kind of flip the health service over against the health service not wanting to do it, and it was immensely damaging. And one of the many things I learned also, though, over the years, but going back to the NHS and looking at where are the landscape reforms, it's really interesting how the NHS has been subject to so many reforms that they, in fact, have been able to develop a way of kind of like, it isn't a hard shell, it's more a kind of soft, gooey shell, and you can politicians can kind of try and aim arrows at it, and somehow it can be in many ways absorbed much better than I feared that it might. I thought the landscape reforms would have been much more damaging than they were. I mean, they were damaging in that they, everybody started thinking about, the landscape reforms, what we're going to do, and it kind of undermined in the health service people's kind of belief in themselves and belief in the system, because it was being attacked. Why was it being attacked? And it was seen as an attack as opposed to a genuine attempt to improve. So I think I learned a lot from that. There's absolutely no way we go anywhere near anything that could be, seen as having that kind of attitude to a public service.
And Rhodri, any kind of lessons on systems change from the front line?
Yeah, I'll just jump back on the Preventive side. One of the really great programs we used to run was in schools, working with young people identified as potentially dropping out of education in sort of final 2 years, and it had massive benefits in terms of keeping young people in education and avoiding some of the issues in terms of letting young people go into the criminal justice system. I think just going back to my sort of introduction. I think that Labour's going to have to be really smart about how it affects change, and it is going to require a kind of very much performance-driven approach, which is about working with what's there and not trying to sort of reinvent the wheel.
I'm going to go to the fourth question. I know you have to leave at 10 past. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
just checking,
okay. So, I'm going to start over here and then go to the gentleman behind and then I'll come to that side of the Sorry.
Hi everyone. So my question's about what
Can
this...
you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course.
I know
Sorry.
who you are.
So my name's Chris Naylor. For the last 7 or 8 years I've been the Chief Executive of Barclay Dagenham Council in East London. And I suppose it's kind of reflecting on that time, which is kind of what's behind my question. Really. So if I just put it into a little bit of context, when I joined that council in 2014, a borough that's, 25 minutes away from the most successful economy on earth. We never spent more on health and social care in the history of mankind. And yet the average healthy life expectancy of women in that borough in 2014 was 53 years old, on average. And that's the age where people are unable to effectively work and live a normal life. Tens of thousands of women, catastrophic for them, catastrophic for the public purse. And I guess the question in the context of austerity that we asked ourselves was, well, what can we do about it? We cannot afford to just keep spending money on addressing the consequences of that issue, but rather try to understand the root cause of what is happening to those tens of thousands of women in that part of East London in their 20s, 30s and 40s that leads to that catastrophic result. When we ask that question, a universe of possibilities open up. Relational working, inclusive economies, the whole gambit. Services based around principles of trust and love and empathy and agency, all the things that you've been talking about this morning. But I tell you what, it was bloody hard, right? And it required root and branch reform of every aspect of what the council did. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think there's a danger sometimes that we see this as small. There's kind of like there's really good public services, and what they need around them to fill the gap is a bit of prevention. And I think my view is no. There's something fundamentally wrong in the design of public services, designed by our great-grandparents' generation, designed to respond to need. That's very, very sensible, logical thing to do. But the problem is when they respond to need, A, it's too late, and secondly, it leads to a set of public services that are designed on exactly the opposite principles to relational. We triage people, we assess people, we put them into professional boxes. So I guess my point here is that whichever political party is able to find a way of narrating and describing and leading a fundamental reform of public services for the good of people and for the good of the public purse, it has saved us millions of pounds in bargaining money. I think A, they will have the prospect of transforming the country, and B, could be in power for generations, because it's like, that's the question. So I suppose for me, like, what will it take? It feels to me it will take a political mission. Polly and I were talking about this last night, an incredibly powerful political narrative. How do you wrestle away from more doctors, more nurses, more hospitals, more police, more of things to respond to need? So what will it take? That's my question. Sorry, a very long preamble, but I hope you make
What will
it.
it take? Okay, and the gentleman behind you, I'll take them in twos.
Yes, my name's Kendrick Fowler, currently work for the civil service. And basically I've sort of seen it from both sides of the fence. So as somebody who had a learning disability and left school at 13, and so basically I left school at 13 because I had someone with dyslexia. I found my needs weren't really met by the education system. And you also know how frustrating it is when you're constantly trying to get somewhere, constantly having training. But also, as someone who's worked in public service for the last 4 months, often people sort of think it's make magic wands and sort of solve every problem, and you sometimes get blamed for things, or people think have powers that you don't really have. So basically my question is, do you agree that though it's important that we have public services that are accessible and for people's needs, you also need to be realistic and fair in our expectations from people who are living on the same set of ground?
And inclusive. Thank you. Do you want to take what will it take?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I picked on Camden as an example earlier because the guy from the Camden Journal was here, but I could have as readily keeps on barking at Dagenham.
Did you notice we left when we started talking about
Maybe the barking newspapers. But I could have easily pointed to barking because the work that Chris and Darren Rockwell, the leader there, are doing is also exemplary. Really sets a model that we could look to. And I agree with you, Chris, that who owns this politics owns the future. Because it's so important to the kind of society that we are. It isn't just about tweaking public services, it goes to the core of what public services are, how they operate and how they relate to people and people relate to them. So it's really about a transformation in a way of an element of our democracy, putting the state in the hands of the people who need to use it. So it's very transformative. And it also leads back to the conversation we had about leadership, because there are different models of leadership. There's a controlling form of leadership, directional leadership, but there's facilitative leadership. And that requires leaders, politicians, professionals, service heads, who understand and have the humility to know that they do not have all the answers and that they need to engage communities directly because they have equally valid insights into their own lives and challenges, although they may not understand service architecture, but their views have to be taken into account on an equal level to the point of view of the professionals. I think that's what you're delivering. In terms of how do you create a political narrative around this, I mean, if Emily or I or any politicians took on the platform with the general public and started talking about co-production and reciprocity and mutuality,
Don't worry,
it would be like, no, you wouldn't want to either, because you might as well be speaking in ancient Greek. But we need to find ways to talk about putting people in control of the public services they use, making them more directly accountable to them. Take back control. You know, there's a reason that was so resonant in the referendum. I was on the other side of that particular debate, but I think there was a feeling about people's lives that they felt they could not control them anymore, whether it's the big factors going across the globe or even more locally, what's happening to people in the workplace and their community or in the public services that they use. And we need to find a way of reshaping democracy around people so they have more direct control over that. And that, I think, there's a political narrative. It needs simpler, better language than I've used to be able to communicate that out. But underpinning it is the much more detailed architecture that you will know far more about than I do, because you're doing it and I just talk about it.
But that doesn't mean to say. I mean, the other problem is. I mean, I hear what you say, but I think we also need to be clear that doesn't mean that we don't think we need more doctors, nurses, teachers. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the problem as well sometimes, is that people get suspicious when you talk about service reform, that actually it's a way of managing cuts. And, you know, we need to kind of get people's faith and confidence about that.
Rhodri, do you want to pick up on our colleague's question about kind of inclusion for public service users?
Yeah, it's really important. As I said earlier, we work with people with a range of disabilities, and some of our programs work with people with quite severe sort of disabilities and health needs. And the focus that we have there, going back to the discussion that we've had, is how you provide holistic services, because again, it's about the ability of that service to be able to respond to the myriad needs of different people. And I think where sort of politicians sort of go wrong is thinking about kind of service users as a homogenous group of people. And actually, everybody wants to turn up and have a service that responds to their bespoke, personalised needs. And in order to do that, you have to have flexibility in service design and think about how you create service user journeys that allow that flexibility to be created, and that's not kind of a top-down approach in the sense of having to say everything must be delivered this way. But we are seeing some interesting changes in the labour market back from COVID. Some of our participants with more severe needs being able to access more jobs now because of hybrid working and more flexible approaches, and there is a benefit coming out of some of those changes in terms of widening access to employment opportunities.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a question here. Yes, you and the woman in front of you as well. We'll take two very quick, because we've only got 6 minutes. Yeah.
My name's Dr. Ruth and I'm GP and I work in the Homeless Services in Manchester. 2 questions, one's for Stephen and one's for... So Stephen, I'm very well versed in autonomous decision making because I'm very well versed in the Mental Capacity Act. The big difficulty that we have is that when we allow autonomous decision making, sometimes we can make really risky, unsafe and very difficult to deal with decisions. Our biggest fear is that we end up in Manchester Evening News. And my biggest fear with the co-production one, which I totally buy into, is that Dr. Ruth saw this patient and allowed them to. And that is just that is my biggest fear. And I think you have to have risk. You have to think about risk and how would you deal with that? The fact that people are making prejudice decisions. Just very briefly, we can talk about relationships. We don't talk about relationships because they're intangible. We talk about people. Who are your friends? Who are your family? Who's your doctor? She's called Dr. Ruth. They're tangible. So we talk about friends and family. Everyone has a mother, sister, brother. Well, they have family. They have friends. So we talk about tangibles.
I'm going to be brutal. Sorry, one question and then
I'll get you afterwards.
Hi, I'm Ali Gunn, Public Affairs Policy Lead for United Response, National Disability Charity. Steve, it's really great to see the commitment and passion for co-production, but often organisations and agencies can be paralysed by the fear of getting it wrong, and I guess that is touching on what Ruth's saying. So how can Labour prevent this from happening and ensure that power sharing is at the heart of any reform?
great questions. Do you want to take those?
Yeah, they link, the two questions link obviously. I think, first of all, in my view, there's a risk in doing this, and like with any risk, you have to manage it. So I'm not advocating that we should give total control to non-professionals living with a particular problem. I'm talking about equalising, balancing the power dynamic between the two. Because I'm not trying to take the professional's perspective out of it, I'm just trying to balance it with the perspective of the people using the expertise of the professional. And well, I think it is co-production actually. It's a negotiation. It's about a negotiation, not one side dictating to the other. And I'm going to talk a bit more about risk as well. There's a risk in not doing it, because many of our public services are failing as it is. You know, we see any number of kids being killed on the streets. You know, as a lot of gang activities. We see, you know, people with mental ill health being treated in ways that they would describe as abusive rather than supportive. So there's a risk in not giving people a bigger voice, as well as I recognise there are risks in doing it as well. It's not that top-down state control gets it right all the time, so why would you ever change that? Because it doesn't. So I think we do have to look at how you might do that. On the second question, which was about the risk aversion from failure, I think this is absolutely a key point that drives us to perhaps being too closed to allow innovation and change to happen. If you're extremely risk averse and you never allow space for innovation, nothing will ever improve. You just get stuck with the system the way that it is now, and you just accept and tolerate that because there won't be anything done differently. We as politicians need to take a different view of risk in order to open up the space for innovation, is my view. If you try to control absolutely everything too much, you don't get innovation, and therefore you don't learn. I think you have to manage those risks because it is going to potentially damage an individual's life, and you absolutely want to minimise any chance of that happening, whether that's the current system or a different system. But if you over-control everything, you don't allow innovation, and then you don't allow learning, and then you don't allow improvement. I think the issue with the problem is you can learn from it if it then informs the system to change. If we keep repeating the problem, then the system is at fault. So I think we need a slightly more mature, grown-up approach to risk and innovation. But I can't emphasise this enough. It is about managing risk, not abandoning ourselves to risk.
In the way that the Tories did with universal credit changes, you know, we told them until we were blue in the face, do not give people with alcohol problems or you know, various abuse problems all of their money, including the money that they should be paying towards their rent, and they just wouldn't listen. And the idea of playing with people's lives in that way, oh, they ought to learn, they ought to make they're addicted. they need somewhere to live. And I remember saying to Priti Patel, who was the minister at the time, and they just wouldn't listen. And it was only after there were terrible tragedies that they finally started changing the system. It's just, you know, reckless.
You might notice we've just lost one of our panel members. Has to rush off to another event. But were there a couple more questions? If we take two more questions and then we can continue the conversation over coffee, maybe, if that's all right. So the lady right at the back here and the gentleman right at the back. Yeah. So that was you.
Oh, that was me, sorry. It's really interesting listening to this. It feels like going back in time by lots of things at the moment. I'm Valerie, I'm a CLP delegate. I was a speech and language therapist. And a lot of the conversations here I remember having when I first qualified, late 80s, early 90s, and seeing those things implemented and then taken away. Being able to do work with early intervention, it was something we fought really hard for, and the impact it has. I worked for the health service, but I spent most of my career in social services settings and in education. How do you get to a point where all that innovation and that cross-working can happen without going back in time and starting everything, clearing the slate and building it up? How do you get back to that without destroying people?
Great question. I'm at the back there.
My name's Sharon, I'm a local councillor in London. And it's good to hear what the panel was saying, because it sounds like you've started to identify some of the root causes as well, because sometimes policy comes out and it's not linked to the root causes. So that's good to hear. I do believe you can measure prevention. The one thing as a ward councillor is the loss of confidence for me of the general public in reporting to police. Basically saying there's no point because nothing gets done. So I'm having to constantly battle that you do need to do that. Now, the issue with our political system is short-termism. It's a massive issue, and I guess it ties in with the lady's question. These are cultural changes that need to be made, and the police, for example, working the way they do, issues in GMP as well, with the way they work. So we need to avoid that them and us thing, but we need long-term cultural change. So how can, Steve would still be here, how can we as a Labour Party ensure that we don't fall into the status quo of the short-termism, setting arbitrary targets and trying to get things done quickly, which is, I also challenge the electorate in Oldham. I say you're part of the problem here because you demand this kind of thing. But if we're going to achieve what is being spoken about in this room, it's going to take a while to embed and create a system that really is focused on the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come back? So I think, I get your challenge, I understand your challenge completely. Then the other side of it is this, right? And you tell me. I mean, we're not going to achieve the sort of change that we want in 4 years. So we do need a certain amount of short-termism, in that we need people to believe that they can trust us and that we're taking the country in the right direction. And we need to be able to show them some evidence of that over a short-term period. So how do you do that then? Given how profound the changes are, and of course, as the woman at the end was saying, we're facing 12 years of a government that has spent their time dismantling, so much of the achievements of the Labour government beforehand. So, so that's, in my brief, in the criminal justice brief, we had domestic violence experts, we had domestic violence courts, we had prosecutors who specialised in domestic violence, we had women who spent their time with the victims of rape and sexual violence, who would spend their time being the person who was the point for them to help them through it. It's all been stripped out. Now people are going, well, that's a good idea, as if it had never happened before. And it's like, oh, maybe we should have more nursery education. Maybe we should have some Sure Start. It's quite difficult, I think, perhaps for someone from my generation who's seen it before, and and when they hear this sort of stuff, they go, yeah. The problem has been 12 years of a Tory government, dismantling it and then kind of trying to introduce something. But I would say there are modern changes, so there are modern challenges too. As I was talking about within my brief, there is also the let's prioritise fraud, let's prioritise financial crime. There are new challenges, and we need to make sure that we respond to that, and we don't fall into the trap, which I think I might, unless I work quite hard at this, going, well, let's just get ourselves back to the days of the Labour government before. Let's repair all the damage and move on, because you also need to look towards the new challenges too. Rhodri, is there anything you want to say particularly about that kind of rebuilding trust between services and people?
Yeah, I think for me one of the challenges is about making sure that you can be really honest with the public about what public services are going to be able to deliver. And as Emily said, you're not going to be able to transform things overnight. And if you think about how we interact with service companies, we want to know when someone's coming to fix your boiler. We want to know how long you've been waiting on a telephone line before someone answers. When you look at some public services, where there are waiting times and backlogs, there isn't physical information about how things are going to fit. And from my perspective, that just breeds further issues around people thinking that those services are somehow completely unfit for purpose, rather than in some cases needing some reform but also underfunding.
I'm going to ask my colleague Ben Glover to put his hand in the air. Ben is our head of research, and Ben is in the process of setting up a relational public services network, which is a platform for us to continue this conversation about public service reform. So if you're interested in being part of that conversation going forward, please talk to Ben afterwards. And I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers and to all of you for being part of this conversation, for such great contributions at the end. So Emily, Rhodri, thank you very much. Thank you.